So welcome and thank you for listening to the podcast for the Center of Religion and Heritage. My name is Anne Wolfmans and together with me is Caroline van Krimpen. We are students in the Master's degree of Religion and Cultural Heritage, and we are here today with Professor Laurajane Smith from the Australian National University. So welcome, Laurajane.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for taking the time.
Thank you for taking the time to talk to me.
Yeah, and thank you. So today we want to talk about the topic of heritage and your views on the role of religion within this field.
So I'm going to ask you the first question. Can you tell us what led you to an interest in heritage?
Oh, what led me to well, that's quite a complicated story. I grew up I grew up in the red light district of Sydney, and it was a very it used to be a very posh area, but had been taken over as a red light district. It had been taken over by lots of working class people, which is why my family was there, and when I was a child, there was a huge demonstration to prevent the pulling down of the houses that people in my family and other people in the community occupied, because these were, as I said, quite posh houses, but they'd been broken up into boarding houses and so on, and therefore had been run down. Mm-hmm. And they wanted to bulldoze these and build up high rises. And it was a very infamous case because there was a lot of distress, a lot of concern about the breaking up of communities, and there was a lot of protests. The labour movement, the union movement got involved, as well as environmentalists and the local community. And I was a child at this time. I was about 12, and this event led to the development of heritage legislation, or helped lead to the development of heritage legislation in New South Wales, the state in which I lived at that time. And it was hailed as a great success because these nice buildings were saved, but of course they were gentrified, and the community that I lived in was broken up, and we were forced to move, and the rents increased, and so on. And I think it had always instilled a passion in me about the idea that, that heritage was important, that the legislation, in this case, the policymakers who claimed a victory for themselves in the development of this legislation had misunderstood the point that what that community of which I'd been a member had been fighting for was the sense of community, the right to live in nice surroundings, the right to live in affordable housing, and so I guess when I got the opportunity to go to university, I was interested in exploring those issues, and I did a degree in archaeology for a range of reasons that were mostly accidental. And I ended up working as a field archaeologist in Australia, but it is archaeologists that largely in Australia do heritage management, that look after heritage. So it was sort of driven by my experiences as a young person, and then the very lucky opportunity I had to go to university, and then to stumble into an area that actually engaged with those issues. And then I worked as a heritage consultant in Australia for 7 odd years before I got the opportunity to work in universities, and have taken that passion forward, that interest and passion forward into heritage, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So within then you write something about the AHD, so the Authorized Heritage Discourse, but also the Critical Discourse Analysis. Can you explain a bit more about what these terms mean and how you use them in your work and research?
Sure. Okay. I started talking about, and I'm not the only one to have done this, to talk about critical heritage studies, in large part to make an argument that I'd been making ever since I became an academic right back in the early 90s, where the dominant perception that heritage was simply an area of management. It was something that you simply did to protect old buildings or archaeological material or other things that were deemed to be of value from the past. And certainly as heritage was practiced then and as I was required to teach it then, it was all about technical matters. What are the policies? How do you list sites that you think are important? How do you do sites assessments? And how do you conserve lime mortar or worry about lime mortar or worry about the erosion of sites and all this sort of stuff? It was all about protecting the physical aspects of the site. And much of the research that was done in heritage at that time in the early 90s was about the technical management. And I and others, of course, were making the argument that actually no, heritage is a social phenomenon and that it needs to be understood as such. What does heritage do, I guess, is the underlying question of critical heritage studies. What does heritage do? What work does it do? What social work, what political work, what cultural work does it do in our societies? What does it mean to people? And how can that research and those understandings inform our heritage practices, the way that we engage with heritage? So a critical heritage studies is about pushing our understanding of what heritage is and what it does beyond a concern for technical management. It doesn't mean abandoning that, but it means that how we practice heritage conservation or preservation, whatever you want to call it, has to be informed by a broader understanding of the values, the meanings, the role that heritage plays in wider society.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and how powerful is the HD still today?
Yes, sorry, you asked me about. You also asked me about the HD, and I to answer that, still think the AHD is very powerful. The Authorized Heritage Discourse is in effect a heuristic device. It's an analytical device and a term that I used for what I see as a dominant sense of not simply talking and thinking about heritage, but practicing heritage. So my concern with discourse comes out of critical discourse analysis, which argues that discourse is not simply some. The discourse has an organising effect on the way we not only think, write and talk about heritage, but on our practices. So it organises our practice, and that there is a ongoing interrelationship between discourse and what we do and the practices that we engage in. So to try and I was concerned in my research. I was concerned with the continual patterns that I saw in people's behaviours and attitudes towards heritage that inevitably got in the way of more progressive and critical forms of engagement with heritage. And that, in my experiences in working in Australia and the United Kingdom and my research interests in the United States and other similar locales, I could see this continual pattern occurring in the discourse and in practice. So I labelled this the Authorised Heritage Discourse in an attempt to, in labelling something that you can observe, will hopefully make it easier to understand not only its impacts and its limitations and the way that it of course frames and influences what we do, but with the desire to challenge that discourse and a desire to challenge the dominant practices and to recognise the way that they exclude, and the way that they can include, but more importantly, the way that they exclude. So yes, I think the authorised heritage discourse is undergoing challenges, not least of which is the UNESCO's own Intangible Heritage Convention that has brought wider awareness of different ways of understanding heritage. I think there is limitations with that convention. I think that convention itself has been influenced by the authorised discourse, but nonetheless, it could have been. It was very limited in the way it was constructed, and part of that limitation was the influence of the AHD. But I do think that the existence of that convention and the awareness given to intangible cultural heritage has challenged the AHD. I think the AHD is under challenge by community interests and greater community voices that are championing new ways and understandings of heritage and making increasingly assertive claims on both national and international communities to be listened to and to be recognised and acknowledged. So yes, I think that discourse is always under challenge. There is always a tension with it, and it was an important aspect of my book that I think gets overlooked a lot, is that while there is the authorised discourse, it is not the only discourse, and nor is it a discourse that is immutable. It is subject to change, and it is by definition constantly challenged and put under tension, and thereby it's changing. Whether it's changing fast enough for my liking is another thing.
Okay, so we both have a background in religious studies, so we are very interested in religious heritage. And do you think there is, or there can be, something like a religious heritage discourse?
Of course there can, and there is, I think, an increasing discourse, is an increasing interest in religious heritage internationally. I mean, to a certain extent there always has been, and embedded within the European authorised heritage discourse is a particular religious understanding of sorry, that's my machine that just went. I don't think I can turn that off. And there is a certain assumptions based on Christianity that have led to, for instance, the almost automatic listing on the World Heritage List, for instance, of Christian cathedrals. So yes, there is a particular taken for granted religious values and understandings that are very much based in Western, I think, certain Christian understandings. It is not an area that I have to acknowledge. I'm a card-carrying militant atheist, and was raised by one who herself was raised by a militant atheist, and I'm raising the fourth generation. But so for me personally, that is not. I think it doesn't speak to me, that sense of, when people talk about spiritual values, I don't know what people mean by that. It's not something that speaks to me, though I understand that that's very important to different communities and individuals. It's not one that I intrinsically understand, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay.
But I do see a concern for religious values coming through, of course, a lot in heritage, and I think there's an increasing discourse emerging about spirituality and spiritual values being given greater prevalence in the discourse. Certainly in Australia, for example, the Borough Charter, which is one of our major policy instruments, has started to, in recent reiterations since it was rewritten in 2013, has included the idea of spiritual values. So, yeah, I see an increasing interest in this area.
Yeah, so our next question is kind of connected to that, because in your article, Theorizing Museum and Heritage Visiting, you explained
Yes.
that heritage is a set of practices and negotiation of, I think, identity, place and memory, and that it's done rather than something that is concerned with materiality and something that you simply have or protect. And we were thinking, so within this heritage making as being a practice, where heritage users or visitors get emotionally engaged,
Yes.
do you think that heritage making can maybe also be seen as some sort of religion or spirituality?
Actually, I think very much so that it can, and it is by certain groups or individuals and communities. I don't think it is necessarily across the board a case, but I do see. I mean, are you referring to that article on theorising visitation? So what I've done is that article is in part comes out of a larger research project that I'm still trying to write up. But as part of that project, I interviewed over 4,500 people at 45 different heritage sites or museums in Australia, the United States and England. And within the different performances, heritage making performances that people engage in as they visit sites and museums, there is, in certain contexts, a search for a sense of spiritual connection to the past that does come out in people's in the way people talk and value heritage, talk about and value heritage. And certainly people often talk about visiting certain places as a pilgrimage, as a pilgrimage to either find themselves or find a sense of connection or linkage to those narratives or meanings that give meaning to their own sense of well-being and self. In some instances, that search can be, I think, quite problematic. In Australia, for example, one of the sites that I interviewed people at is a site called Uluru, which is on the World Heritage List. Uluru also used to be known as Ayers Rock. You may be familiar with it, but Uluru is it's a site of religious importance to Indigenous Australians and in particular the communities who are regarded as the traditional owners of this place. And it's also a place of significant international and domestic tourism. And of course, the Indigenous community asks that people don't climb Uluru because it's an offence. A, because it's dangerous, and B, because it spiritually they prefer you not to do it. But a lot of Australians do climb because it's there. They climb it. But there is in many of the interviews with non-Indigenous Australians that I did at that site, there was a sense in which they saw Indigenous peoples having a connection to Uluru and a connection to landscape, a connection to place, that they associated with a sense of religious assurance, that they spiritual security, if you like, for want of a better word, and that they themselves were seeking to emulate that. They were seeking to gain some sense of spiritual connection themselves. that would help them underpin their sense of Australian identity. And in many cases, that was quite an interesting phenomenon, one that I think needs further research and looking into. There was also the phenomenon, though, that was associated with it that was less positive, and that there was often an appropriation going on where people in visiting these places were claiming Indigenous culture as part of their own culture and reworking the spiritual and cosmological meanings of the site to fit in with their own personal or nationalistic understandings and values. And sometimes that was quite it was certainly a colonial process, but it was also sometimes quite a significantly problematic racist process. And again, that's something interesting that occurred in the research that I'm trying to write up now.
Okay. Well, I have another question which came up. What do you think the role is of heritage organizations for the engagement of visitors? Because sometimes I have the feeling that people only visit sites because there are only maybe UNESCO heritage list. So they visited just purely as a tourist site. So what do you think the role is of these big heritage organizations?
Okay. I think we make a lot of assumptions about why people visit heritage sites and museums. We tend to assume that people visit for education because they want to be educated, or they visit simply to have a nice day out, and that in doing so as a touristic visit, they switch off their brains and they're just, and we assume that visitors are passive and that they're an empty vessel, if you like, to be filled with the information that museum curators or heritage interpretive staff will fill with information. Now, what my research is certainly showing is that we make a significant mistake in assuming that people are simply there as mindless tourists or simply there to be educated. People visit for a range of reasons, and they use their visit for a range of very different reasons. Some of them quite significant, some of them banal. But those visitations individually and collectively all do cultural work. They all do political and social work. They do things, they have consequences, and they construct meaning for visitors. That meaning is sometimes influenced by the interpretation that the heritage site or museum controls, but very often not. Visitors construct their own meanings, and they do so quite mindfully. They do so often quite actively. We may not, and they do so in a range of ways with a range of different outcomes. So yes, of course, heritage professionals and museum staff have a role to play in the interpretations that they provide at heritage sites and museums, but I think they need to. I think we misunderstand what that role is, and we need to have a better understanding of why visitors come. Not only why visitors come, but more importantly, what visitors do when they're there. Before we can really work out what that role should be. I think we as I said, we make the assumption that our role is as educators, but the majority of people don't go really to be educated. They go to reinforce what they already know, believe, and feel about the history that the site is or the different culture or the culture that the site is representing. So I think we need to reassess what that role is, but before we can do so, we need to really engage with, on a more respectful level, and a more considered and a more critical level, what people do at sites. Now, I'm not saying, that doesn't mean to say that I think, people are entirely positive and they do positive things. Some of the consequences of what is done can be quite reactionary and conservative. But people have agency, and we can't dismiss them as simply tourists having a nice day out. They have agency, they are doing things, and we need to understand that so that we can either facilitate what they're doing or intervene to produce understandings of heritage that we find more satisfactory or politically more acceptable, whatever that may be.
Okay, final question. What is your favorite place of heritage, or do you have a favorite museum or something?
Oh, my favourite place of heritage. Or do I have a favourite museum? Personally, my favourite place of heritage would be the Australian landscape. Just being out in the bush, particularly the semi-arid landscape, and just being in the landscape is for me, is what for me is meaningful in terms of providing me with a sense of heritage, a heritage making. I guess that would be my favourite site. But my favourite museum, I think I have two. Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, Tennessee, and the Immigration Museum in Melbourne, both because I found them interesting from a professional level, but also from a personal level. I think they're both sites that don't have a lot of artefacts, and they use a range of means of telling stories that are very emotionally powerful, and you can see that the curatorial staff in both of those places had a lot of emotional intelligence in the way that they constructed those exhibitions, and weren't afraid to engender emotion in the visitors. And thus, I think I probably had the most powerful responses as a visitor myself at those two museums.
Okay. So that's it. Thank you so much for your time, Professor Smith, and also thanks to anyone who listens to this podcast from the Center of Religion and Heritage.